Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute at the University of Melbourne. I'm Georgina Downer and I'm the host of Afternoon Light. Each week I speak to leading thinkers from around the world about Robert Menzies, his life, his era and his enduring legacy. In this week's episode of Afternoon Light, I had the great honour and pleasure of speaking to Sir Robert's daughter, Heather Henderson, about her reflections growing up as Sir Robert's daughter and accompanying her father on official engagements and visits around Australia and the world. I want to thank Heather for the time she gave me and the reflections that were so intimate and frank. It was a great pleasure to record this podcast and I hope you enjoy it just as much as I did. Heather, I wanted to start our discussion today by asking you about what your father did for Australia's relationship with Japan so soon after the war. It was really quite incredible in the context of the times, wasn't it?
It was very surprising, so soon after the war.
So soon.
And it was very good for Australia, I think. I think we were lucky that he did. And he always seemed to have good relations with their ambassador here, and he tried very hard. My brother had fought during the war. He'd been up in Bougainville. But I think he was very keen. He was very good at seeing what was going to happen, seeing into the future. And I think he knew how important it was for Australia to get on with Japan, even though it was difficult, to say the least, difficult.
Did he like visiting Japan with your mum? It would have been culturally so different.
I know.
And we weren't used to travelling overseas like we are these days.
No, but... Well, he had travelled overseas, certainly, during the war, but my mother was the one who was vitriolic about them.
Okay.
But my father was more measured about it. But it was very hard to live through the war and feel friendly to the Japanese, to say the least.
Yeah.
We all knew people. I mean, I remember my doctor going to the war, and he was in a prisoner of war camp, and he came back bent in double. He was just, I couldn't believe it when I saw him. And that hit me, and also the fact that so many of the children of my parents' friends had been killed or maimed in some way. It was very hard to be civil to them, even civil, certainly not friendly. So Dad was extraordinary, I think, the way he did try very hard, although it must have been pretty hard even for him, I think.
I think it must have been an extraordinarily difficult thing to do.
Yes.
To look beyond what had just happened.
Yes.
To, as you say, the children of your friends.
Yes.
Of your countrymen, that they've been killed by these people,
yes.
And then to say, but actually we're going to turn over a new leaf and have this really important economic relationship with this country,
yes.
And I'm going to go there and do business with them, yes. And try and start afresh.
It was extraordinary, I think, and I can remember as a schoolgirl during the war, and we used to read about the tortures they went in for. And when the Japanese bombed Darwin and it looked as if they might come into Australia, I can remember being absolutely terrified that my father would be arrested, of course, and he'd be tortured.
Yeah.
And I can remember nightmares about that.
Of course, of course, yeah. Well, that would be natural. How old were you during the war, Heather? You were in...
When the war started in 1939, so yes. I was 10 or 11.
Right, yeah. And so living in the lodge in 1939?
No, I stayed at home because we had somebody there who...
In Melbourne?
In Melbourne.
Yeah.
Who looked after me. And I actually went to the same school but as a boarder because they had boarders as well. And when my parents were home, I came home, which was a bit stupid looking back because I was not one thing or the
Oh,
other.
you were in and out of the boarding
Yes.
house, yeah.
But that's the way they organised it, and the headmistress was very tolerant.
Yes, yeah.
But I used to go up to the Canberra for school holidays, and there was one school holiday when there was a polio scare in Melbourne, and so I stayed in Canberra for the whole of the middle term.
Oh, okay.
And instead of going exactly to school, I went and had lessons with Jane Casey and Githa Wade with somebody who taught them in I suppose it was their garage, really.
Oh, really?
Which was so good for me because there were only three of us, so I had to work. I couldn't just sit and let my brain go off somewhere else. But Jane was the daughter of Dick Casey.
Oh, right.
And Githa's father was a geologist, so they remained friends for the rest of their lives.
Oh, so that was, quite similar to what children have just experienced here with COVID.
Yes,
You're
yes.
not able to attend your actual school, so
Yes.
you've gone somewhere else to do some sort of homeschool.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I think we forget, don't we, that there were epidemics in the past, and you had pandemics in the past, and people had to muck through that. I mean, polio was a real.
Polio was
scary prospect, wasn't it?
And people I knew, a lot of people I knew were damaged for life.
Yeah. And Heather, you were telling me about the Office of the Prime Minister and your reflections on that, which I find fascinating. We think about Prime Minister's offices now, Premier's offices. What was your dad's office like? He had very famous personal private secretaries, of course, Bill Heseltine and...
Well, he had Eileen Lennon and then Hazel Craig and Everil Wilkinson was there for a long time. And of course, they were almost part of the family because it was only a very small office. And he had a secretary who was from the department. So that's what Bill Heseltine, how he got him. He went there from the department, the Prime Minister's department. And it was a completely different setup. And he didn't have a media, what do you call it, a media representative?
Media advisor?
What was known as press secretary.
Yes. Yeah.
He didn't even have that to begin with. It wasn't until quite a lot later, I think it's certainly after 1950, 49, 50, and I think he was finally persuaded it would be a good idea.
So how was he handling the media before having a press secretary? Would they just come directly to him?
Yes.
Oh, goodness. Can you imagine that in this day and age?
No.
It's interesting. There's we were having a discussion the other day with Troy Bramston and my dad, Alexander Downer, about whether politics is harder today than it was, in the Howard era or I guess in the Menzies era. And Troy said, yes, it is, because the 24-hour media cycle, there's never a break in, okay, we've got the press release out for the nightly news, now we can have a break until the next morning type thing. Whereas my dad, he was saying, no, it was hard then and it's hard now. It's not, I mean, the way you conduct yourself is maybe a bit different, but it's still hard.
Yes.
But obviously it was hard if you didn't even have a press secretary.
I think it's terribly hard now because it's 24 hours a day, more or less.
Yes.
And they stop in their tracks wherever it is, and for some reason they feel they have to answer. That's what I don't understand. I mean, I can remember Dad saying, no, see you tomorrow. Yeah? But he wouldn't just answer questions like, or sometimes he would, depends, but he didn't feel he had to.
So do you think that's because that was because of who he was? Was he someone who sort of wanted to always take a moment to think about how to deal with a situation or how to respond to an issue? Or do you think that, and you know, and maybe today, in today's day and age, there's just an expectation you have to have got an opinion straight away.
Yes.
You know, we don't give people a chance to collect their thoughts and think. Do you
well,
think
part of it is the fault of the person being questioned. Why do they feel they have to answer?
Yeah.
I mean, so often I can remember Dad saying, no, see you tomorrow. And in fact, that famous one when he came back from overseas and his press secretary was Ray Maley.
Right.
And Ray had said to him, you know, this is ridiculous. You get back to Australia after a long flight, and of course it was slower in those days.
That's right.
And you're tired, and it's very difficult to answer questions. So I suggest you say, we'll have a conference tomorrow at 10 o'clock and leave it at that. They can wait till then.
Yeah.
But having sent that message, there were still some press people there at the airport, and he brushed them aside and said, no, boys, no, see you tomorrow. And then when some young man rushed up and said, oh, Mr. Menzies, I'm from the Sydney Morning Herald. And he looked at him and said, that, dear boy, is your misfortune.
He didn't like the Sydney Morning Herald much.
But he sort of got away with it. I suppose they hated him, but he didn't care if they liked him or not.
Did he have a good relationship with the media, do you think?
I don't think. You see, it wasn't really media then. It was really just press.
The newspapers, really. Yes.
Oh, the television, yes, had come in the end, but that was different. But not entirely. I mean, some of them thought he was terrible. He got on better with some than with others.
Yeah.
But I think whether they liked him or not, they respected him.
And that's incredibly important. And your mum was amazing how she accompanied your father on just so many visits.
Yes, she did.
She
did.
She really, for those 16 odd years of the second term, I mean, that was a full-time job for her, wasn't it?
Oh, yes, it was a full-time job.
Amazing.
It was a full-time job.
I don't think we expect quite that much these days of the Prime Minister's spouse.
No, and also domestically, you see, the lodge was not run as it is now, like a sort of hotel or something. But in those days, she, had to organise things in the house.
Yeah.
And it was just like a family home, but with a cook and a housemaid and a parlourmaid, or whatever they were called. But it was completely different. But I can remember in one letter that Dad wrote, he said, your mother is mentally afflicted because she's making, umpteen speeches all around Australia.
Yes, in her own right, she was having to do these speeches. Yes, wow.
So she did a lot of speaking, and she was good at it too. But I can remember somebody of her age talking to me once and saying, we often wonder how on earth Pat has managed to do that, because nothing in her background prepared her for it.
Oh.
Her mother died when she was young. She went to boarding school. But somehow she managed to do all those sort of things, stand up in public and speak. And
yes, because she wasn't the one who chose public life. Your father did. And yet she was
thrown
a fulsome participant.
Yes,
Yeah.
And being asked questions by the press, being interviewed, and all that sort of thing. But I thought she was extraordinary the way she coped with it, actually. And I've got to say, I did go overseas with my parents several times, or a couple of times, when he went to London for Prime Minister's conferences. But one year my mother was not well, and I went instead of her, which was absolutely amazing for me, because there I was, I suppose, Dad's hostess or whatever you might call it.
That's right.
So I was in
first
on
daughter.
everything. So I knew all of all the great.
How did you find that? Was it terribly intimidating?
Well, no, I think I accepted it as part of life by then.
Right, yeah.
And people are people. And I've always remembered that for life. And I can remember when Peter and I got engaged, Sir William Slim was Governor General, and he said, "Oh, look, dear, this is very good. You'll be very good at that in the diplomatic world." And I said, "Well, I won't, because I don't care who sits next to whom at the table." And he said, "Never forget, those who care don't count, and those who count don't care."
Great.
And I've remembered it forever, and it is so true.
Yeah. So in those times when you were playing the role of first daughter, stepping in for your mum, who were the most interesting people you met? And they might not have been the ones who should have counted, obviously.
No, well, the first that springs to mind was Danny Kaye.
Oh, right.
Because when we were in New York, there was a woman there she was Australian, I think, but she had great connections with the show business world. And she said, "Is there anyone your father would like to meet?" So without hesitation, I said, "Yes, Danny Kaye."
Did he want to meet Danny Kaye, or did you want to meet Danny Kaye?
I wanted to. She said, to my horror, she said, "Oh, I think I can organise that." And I thought, "Oh, ye gods." And then she rang back and said, "He's going to come to the hotel an hour before you leave." So then I had to tell Dad, and he said, "Danny Kaye, never heard of him." And I said, well, so I tried to explain, because he hadn't been on the scene for very long then.
Right.
And so I was, biting my fingernails practically. Dad, we were packed up, ready to go, and there was Dad stamping up and down saying, "Danny Kaye, never heard of him." The knock on the door, in came Danny Kaye. He walked straight over to the sideboard, poured himself a whiskey.
Oh, right.
And said, "You're not going to leave this here, are you?" And then sat down in an armchair with his legs across the side of the
You're
arm.
joking.
And proceeded to be enchanting.
Lovely.
And he and my father became best friends.
No.
And
So you were the matchmaker?
I was a matchmaker. and in fact, when Danny Kaye had a show in Melbourne many years later, when Dad had a stroke and Dad went in his wheelchair, Danny looked down, saw him, and he stopped the show, just walked down, walked up, kissed him on the forehead, walked back on stage. The whole place erupted, you can imagine.
Oh, that's very touching.
Isn't it?
Oh, gorgeous. So that was your most lasting impression of meeting someone.
But mind you,
the product of quite a successful friendship.
But I certainly, I met and knew all the leaders and everything.
Yeah.
So
yeah. Yes, because you of course developed a friendship with Mary Churchill, Mary Soames, didn't you? Yeah. Of quite long standing.
Until she died.
Until she died.
Yes.
Yeah.
But I didn't meet her during the war or anything like that because I was at school. But after we met, we always stayed in touch.
Did you share experiences about having fathers in those positions? I mean, fathers who became figureheads of their countries too. It's quite amazing, isn't it?
I don't know. I can't remember anything specific.
You'd be asked this much more often than me, but I'm often asked, "Oh, what's it like to have a famous father?" And I said, "But I've only ever had one father."
Yes.
So, it's not like I had that other life where I had the non-famous father.
Yes, but that's exactly right. That's exactly right.
He is as he is, and my childhood is as it is, and for better and worse, and all in between. They are my experiences. No. But your dad loved the arts, didn't he? That's
Yes.
theatre and poetry.
Yes.
In the collection at Melbourne Uni, we've had this librarian going through the collection,
I love
book
that.
by book by book, and it's very special. Actually, I haven't told you this before. He has found in the Melbourne University magazines, and your dad was involved, I think, from about 1913 to 16, and he was editor one year. Poetry that your dad has written as part of the magazine's
Yes.
arts offering, and there are about 30 of them. And he was obviously quite
Oh, he was
taken with writing poetry, and we thought we might even make a little anthology of them. I was quite interested in all this poetry and the books of poems that he collected.
Yes.
There's quite a touching one from Lord Gowrie that his son had written, and his son died in the war, and Lord Gowrie and Lady Gowrie have given it to your dad, and it's so, they've written an inscription about how much they obviously love their son, and they want these poems to be appreciated, to keep his memory alive. I thought that was quite beautiful that your dad's kept that book in his collection till his dying day.
Yes, oh, he would have. They were very fond of the Gowries.
Yes.
And my parents, we had a little Scotch Terrier dog, and when they came up to Canberra, we used to come to, but it loved wandering. And one day Lord Gowrie rang and said, "What's the name of your dog?" And my mother or father, I can't remember who answered, but said, "Oh, it was Mac, I think." And he said, "Oh, we've been calling him Bruce," or whatever it was. And she said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, he's on the pale blue sofa at the moment, having a little rest." And the dog had wandered out there.
The government house.
The government house.
How funny.
But and Lady Gowrie always wrote to Mum, PM2. That's right. PM2. And because the English are very good at writing letters, or were all the time.
Yeah, fantastic.
And she was very good at it. My mother was hopeless. So, I mean, when she wrote a good letter, but she didn't care for getting round to putting pen to paper.
And we were talking about before, another good friend of your dad's, Felix Frankfurter, and in the collection we have a lovely book that Justice Frankfurt has given to your dad.
Oh, yes.
About how much your dad loved the law, and the lawyer was always deep inside him.
Yes.
And they obviously had a meeting of the minds on the law and legal issues. But it's quite interesting, isn't it, that he was so friendly with a US Supreme Court judge. It would have, hard to imagine that in today's context, an Australian Prime Minister going and staying with a US Supreme Court judge. It was sort of almost, in today's context, you'd think, oh, is that appropriate? Because, is it interfering in the American judicial system? All those conspiracy theorists, imagine that.
Well, it was much easier than those days because he was not surrounded by dozens of people, or sort of minders, whatever you call them. And so he could actually talk to somebody like that, just the two of them. And if they got on well, that's fine. They could continue the friendship.
It's nice. It's lovely to think that. I mean, life seemed a bit, sort of somewhat simpler then.
Oh, much easier, I think. Much easier.
But I guess travel was slower, so you had more time.
And security, there was not all this security.
No.
I mean, even in Canberra, you can't even leave a letter at the gate of the lodge. No. They won't take it.
You get, it might have something nasty in it.
Might have a bomb in it.
Yes, or some poison powder. Or, no, it's a less innocent world now, isn't it? Yes.
I'll tell you something that's interesting with my father. He was very good at getting on with, people in his office to begin with, but at home.
Oh, yeah.
And there was I think I've got it in my book actually, about Agnes, the girl who, just thinking, was she from the Ukraine?
Oh, really? Okay.
I can't think, but it's somewhere like that.
Yes.
And she was on her way to the university when the war came, and so she never got back to see her family.
Oh.
And she was stuck, and horrendous. But she migrated after the war. She got to Australia, and for some reason she was given a job at the lodge.
Oh, right.
To clean.
Yeah.
Or do something, domestic work. But by then she was married to Vasil Glembowski, who was working somewhere else. He ended up being a linesman, I think. But she was taken to the lodge, and he was taken off somewhere else to be dropped off to wherever he was going. She didn't know where he'd gone. They had arrived by train, and there was the station from very early in the morning for about 3 hours, waiting for somebody to come and pick them up.
Right.
So they weren't treated very well when they got here. And when she arrived at the lodge, the housekeeper was Mrs. Pinkham, who said, "What is your name?" And she said, "Nadia." She said, "Oh, we can't be bothered with that. We'll call you Agnes."
All right.
Well, it must have been 10 years before I discovered she was not Agnes.
She was Nadia.
She was, and this wretched woman didn't say, "Look, I'll show you your room, etc., and you must be tired, you'd like a cup of tea," nothing like that. She said, "There's the washing up."
Wow.
So she had a pretty awful time when there was nobody living. The Prime Minister was not living there.
Yes.
And then the Chifleys came occasionally. Mrs. Chifley came very occasionally, but she and Agnes got on very well.
Yeah.
So they sent her a Christmas card every year until they died. So she, which I then gave back to the Chifleys' house. But she, when my parents got there, they treated her like a human being, and she was very amusing.
Was she? Was her English good?
Oh, by then it got better, but she was very funny, talking about learning English, how they would cheat, be a bit mean to her, and she was told to go to the butcher and get some bum steak. So she just thought that's what you ask for, and the butcher nearly flipped, of course. And so there were 2 or 3 things like that where they'd given her the wrong meat. They were pretty mean to her. But they got on really well with my parents too, and I got on well with her. In fact, I stayed in touch with her forever. But I can remember one time when my parents had somebody staying there from overseas. I can't remember what nationality, whatever he was. They had to go out somewhere, but he was tired and he'd gone to lie down, and so Dad had said to Agnes, "Make sure you wake him up." So there was Dad waiting to go out to this function, and the visitor didn't appear, and he said, "Ag, for goodness sake, did you wake him up?" And Ag said, "Well, what does mean?" so in other words, no, he hadn't quite woken up.
So I don't know if I told you this, the other day in the April, just after Easter, I think it was, or before Easter, we went to Japarut.
Oh, did you?
Yes, yeah.
What
with
fun.
My husband and 2 children.
Good on you.
Yeah, and we went to Menzies Square, which is quite lovely actually. It's amazing how remote it is.
Yes.
I don't think people realise that No,
It's still-
Bob Menzies did not come from
No,
Kew
no.
or Hawthorne. He came from a tiny little town, like hundreds of kilometres from Melbourne, hours away from a big centre. I mean, even Ballarat.
But he was very lucky that he had parents who had a great belief in education, and the whole family benefited from that, of course.
Yeah. But it's really, I think it's important for people to realise that.
Yes.
That you don't have to come from
Oh no.
anything in Australia.
No, if you've got it, and if you want to do better, you can.
Yeah. Have you been to Japarut?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes, it was very funny because Peter and I went and wanted to have a look, and so we thought if we went to the local pub we might meet someone. You know?
Oh, yes.
So we started talking to someone who happened to have the same name as some, I recognised it. So that was good fun. So
Yes, yeah.
he sort of showed us around and told us all about it.
Yeah. And Heather, tell me about your parents. Where did they first meet? Just in Melbourne?
I think at the tennis club in Kew or Hawthorne, somewhere there.
Yeah.
But they used to go to... Dad went to church with the school, Mum went to church with her school. And I think when Dad was... She accused him of having said, "You're the girl who used to make eyes at me in church." I'm sure it was invented, but never mind. They did go to church, the same church, I think.
Did they? Yeah. He was very handsome, your dad.
Menzies' family were good, strong faces too.
Yes, yeah.
Dad was interesting like that he took a great interest in a lot of young ones.
That's good. That actually is something my dad recollects about your dad.
Really?
He says he always took such a great interest in us as children of his, of obviously his colleague, my grandfather.
Yes.
Always interested in what my dad and his sisters were doing and what they were wanting to do with their lives. And, of course, really? Dad, a teenager, thinking, wow, Robert Menzies has asked me about me. How amazing. He was quite flattered.
And I can remember hearing somebody speak. He said that when he was at university, his father was killed. I think this was during the war or something. But Dad, he was at university in England, and Dad went to the university to tell him.
Oh, you really?
I couldn't believe it.
Wow, that's very sweet. Oh, goodness. That must have been a very difficult conversation.
Very. But he didn't leave it just to a telegram or something. So.
Oh, well, I'm sure that stayed with him, that gesture.
Yeah. Well, he always took an interest in the young ones. It was quite interesting.
Yeah. Well, they're the future. It's important. Well, that's probably one of the reasons why he did so much for education. See,
well, partly, but also because he knew what education had done to him, for him.
Yeah.
And I think, like his parents, it's that Scottish background, I think, of education, Not that he was very good at making sure his own children were educated.
Oh, really?
No.
You didn't feel it applied domestically, just more in the public?
We wouldn't. A great disappointment. And when our daughter, Edwina, got a law degree, he was absolutely thrilled. He said, "It's my first descendant to get a university degree."
So you didn't go to university? Your brother?
Well, I did, but I didn't graduate. And my brother Ken started. He did a year of law, and then he went to the war, joined the army.
Yes.
Then he didn't come back and finish that.
No.
And Ian started agricultural science, but he had a medical problem, shall we say?
Yes.
And he couldn't go do that close study, and he had bad eyes, and so he went to Dookie Agricultural College, where he was Dux of Dookie, so I mean there's nothing wrong with that.
No, that's great. Yeah, so he finished at the college.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, that's interesting, but I guess that reflects your different interests.
Well, thank you to Heather Henderson for that wonderful discussion about her recollections growing up as the daughter of Sir Robert. The Afternoon Light podcast is brought to you by the Robert Menzies Institute at the University of Melbourne. You can find more about the Institute and our podcast at robertmenziesinstitute.org.au. We're also on Twitter, on Facebook and LinkedIn. We look forward to you joining our show next week. Thank you.